Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ktor Server Fundamentals playlist. In the last video, we covered digest authentication in Ktor. In this video, we will dive into barrier authentication in Ktor. So, let's begin by understanding what barrier authentication is. Barrier authentication is a part of HTTP framework used for access control. It is commonly used with OAuth and JWT. Speaking of JWT, we will have a dedicated video covering it in detail, but for today, our focus will be on implementing custom logic for handling barrier tokens in Ktor. Now, let's start by configuring barrier authentication in Ktor. If you have been following along with our previous authentication videos, you might already have the Ktor server auth dependencies added. In that case, you don't need any extra dependency for this video. Else in your version catalog file within this Gradle, you will need to add this Ktor server auth module, and in your build.gradle kts file, you'll need to add this dependency Ktor server auth. Now, in plugins package, let's create a new Kotlin file and name it barrier authentication. Inside this file, let's define an extension function for setting up barrier authentication. Now, within this function, we first need to install the authentication plugin using install function, and within this install function, we can pass authentication. For barrier authentication, similar to basic and digest authentication, we have a barrier function. So we can say barrier. We can also assign a name to this authentication scheme. So let's name it barrier auth. Next, let's add a realm which will be used in authentication challenges. So we can say realm equals access protected routes. To validate the token, we can use the authenticate function. We can say authenticate, and within this we get access to token credentials. Within this authenticate, we can implement custom token validation. For example, we can check if the token exists in our database and retrieve the corresponding user. When a client logs in or sign ups, we can generate a token and return it as a response. The client can then use the token to access the protected routes. More details on generating and sharing token will be covered in the JWT authentication video. Now, to simulate the database, let's create a simple map that stores token and the corresponding username. So, for that, we can say val usersdb. This will be of type map of string to string. Now we can simply say map of, and we'll have a token as a key, and corresponding to this token we'll have a user. So for token 1 we can have user 1, and similarly let's create for token 2 user 2. For token 3 it will be user 3, and for 4 we'll have user 4. In a real world scenario, token will be stored in a proper database with a structured format. For now, we are simply mapping tokens to username. Using this, we can retrieve the username based on the token provided. We can say something like val user equals users db, and we can look for the token. So for that, we can use token credential and get the token. Now, if token is among any of them, then we will be getting the corresponding username for that token. If the token exists in our database, we can simply return the user ID principal with that username. So we can add a check. Let's suppose user dot is null or blank. In case this user is not null or blank, we can simply return the user ID principal with the value of this user. So it will, for token 1, it will be user 1. else we can simply return null. What this will indicate is if we return this user ID principal with non-null value, then it will indicate authentication is success and they can be allowed to access the resource. Else, when we return null, it will throw the 401 status code. Now, we can call this configure barrier authentication function within the application module function just above the routing. So we can say configure barrier authentication, and we can comment this digest authentication as well that we had configured in the last video. Next, within this routing, we'll need to set up the authentication configuration for the barrier. So for that, we can simply replace this digest with barrier. This is coming from over here. So we are referring using the same name. Let's try to return username as well for the particular authentication token. We can say something like val username equals. Now we can use call.principal, and over here we are returning the user ID principal for successful validation. So we can refer to user ID principal. We can simply say name. This name will be the one that we are passing here. So for token 1 it will be user 1. So if user is logging with token 1, then we'll get user 1 value. So we can simply say hello and name, username. Now if we run our application, now let's try this out. We can select the auth as barrier token, and for token within our DB we have token 1 for user 1. So let's enter token 1, and if we send, as you can see, we get hello user 1, since this token 1 is corresponding to this user 1. If we use token 2, then we get user 2, and similarly for 3 and pro as well. So you can see that authentication is working as expected. That's it for this video. In the next video, we will cover session authentication in Ktor. Until then, thanks for watching and happy coding.